one point that the world was on the edge. It feels at times like the world is on the edge of self-destruction. And so what are the things that are the reality around us that we sometimes avoid, try and kind of bury ourselves with other things? So I watched the news or listened to the news this week and was looking for some of those things that I might have been avoiding. And one of the things I heard this week is that Regina has the second highest crime severity index in Canada. We are behind Lethbridge, Alberta, and ahead of both Winnipeg and Saskatoon. And I tried to find out what the crime severity index is, and I couldn't quite figure it out. It's some kind of a mathematical formula where you take the number of crimes, and I'm sure the population and the kind of crime, and add it all together and come up with this number. This is not really new. I have heard various kinds of this kind of statistic about Regina for most of the 24 years that I've lived in Saskatchewan. At one point, I think we made the front cover of Maclean's as the murder capital of Canada, right? That was kind of, somebody came along and dubbed us that. But when I heard about one of the stories that I heard this week was actually about people that are trying to do something about it. There was a town hall meeting held at the Mama Boyatson Center on Thursday evening. CBC's The Fifth Estate was here hosting a town hall meeting for people like Police Chief Evan Bray, and plus some people from Boston who were part of what was called the Boston Miracle, and community members who wanted to talk about gang-related violence in Regina and how to respond as a community. So I heard the story, I thought, what the heck is the Boston Miracle? So I had to do some research then. So apparently in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Boston, Massachusetts was a city that was deeply divided along racial lines, and it had a huge problem with gang violence. And some of the people that were in the worst, some of the ministers actually in the worst neighborhoods watched as the gang violence escalated and the police presence to try and suppress it came harder, and the gang violence would escalate and the police would come down harder, and it would escalate, and it was almost an unending cycle. And the pastors of some of the churches said, there's something wrong with this system. It isn't working. And they were people that were in touch with the family members of the gangs. And they knew that there was a problem. And so they said, we need to do something about it. We need to do something about it because what's happening isn't working, and we can't live with this any longer. It has been going on for far too long. And so they started to act. And I'm going to come back and tell you how they did that in a few minutes. But it's that question of how long? How long do we have to wait for the world to change that Jeremiah is facing and the people of Jerusalem are facing this morning when we meet them? So last week, I will tell you, the book of Jeremiah is not in chronological order. So if you actually want to read the book of Jeremiah from the beginning to the end, it does not all happen in chronological order. So when I talked about last week when Jeremiah is sitting on the rubble of Jerusalem, that actually happens after what we hear today. But today we meet up with Jeremiah, and they give us, I don't know if you've noticed, but they gave us the author gave us very distinct timelines. He said it's the 10th year of Zedekiah and the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. So this is the only time in the book of Jeremiah when they actually give us historical references as to what year it was. So we know from that it has been 10 years since the initial attack of Babylon on Jerusalem. The initial attack happened, some of the people were taken away, and the city was left mostly intact. There was a king, Zedekiah, and Zedekiah had a plan. He said, Egypt doesn't like Babylon any more than we do, so Egypt's army will come and protect us from Babylon. It'll be great. Jeremiah was not impressed. So Jeremiah preached against this plan, and Zedekiah said, I am tired of hearing you. We're going to put you in jail. So by the time we get to today, it's 10 years after the initial attack. The Babylonian army is back at the gates of Jerusalem. Egypt is nowhere to be found. Jeremiah is in jail, and Zedekiah is like, I don't know what to do now. And Jeremiah is probably sitting in jail saying, I told you so. And in the midst of all this chaos, Jeremiah has a vision from God. And God says, your cousin Hanamel is going to come and offer to sell you some land. You should buy it. And wouldn't you know, Hanamel comes along. And you need to know that in Israel at this time, land was the difference between life and death. Because there weren't supermarkets, and there weren't grocery stores, and there wasn't a whole social system like we have where you could get food. You had to grow your own food. So you had to have land in order to survive. So the regulations around land in Israel were that if you had land you no longer needed, the first people you had to offer to sell it to was a family member, so that you could keep it in the family, so that the family could continue to survive. So Hanamel comes along, and he's from Anathoth, which is a little bit outside of Jerusalem, and it's an area that if you read earlier in Jeremiah, you will discover that the people in Anathoth really don't like Jeremiah. They've been trying to kill him for years. So Hanamel comes along, and he says, Jeremiah, would you like to buy this land? It's yours. You have first right of refusal. And we can kind of imagine that Hanamel might be thinking, why would he buy this land? Like, Babylon's about to attack. He's never going to see it. This seems like a waste of time, but I'll offer him the land because I need a little bit of money to get my family out of town. So he comes along and offers Jeremiah the land, and Jeremiah says, sure, I'll buy it. And you can almost see Hanamel's eyes popping out of his eyes and saying, are you sure? And Jeremiah says, oh yes, I will buy the land. I am sure. And Jeremiah is not known at this point in his life or ever as a prophet who brings words of hope. So far, besides telling the king of Jerusalem that he was wrong, Jeremiah has done things like wear the yoke of an oxen around town to show people how burdened they are by their lack of faith. Or he bought a clay pot at one time and smashed it in front of all the religious leaders and said, if you don't come back to faith, this is what the God of hosts will do to you. So Jeremiah says these things and does these things, and then he goes and buys land. And he doesn't do it privately. He doesn't just kind of like hand the money over. He says, do it here. I'm going to give you all of this money. He weighs it out in front of all the people in the square around the jail. And then he signs the deed, and he takes the deed, and he says, take this to my secretary Baruch to keep it safe for me. For this is what the Lord of hosts says. The God of Israel says, houses will be built, land will be bought, vineyards will grow again in this land. It's a word of hope in the face of what seems like an impossible situation, because as I said, the Babylonian army is standing at the gates of Jerusalem ready to crush the city. And we know from last week, the story that we read earlier that happens after, it happens, people do get taken from Jerusalem and the city is destroyed. And yet, Jeremiah offers this word of hope. Things will get better, he says. If we read farther along in Jeremiah, we will discover that Jeremiah writes to the people who are in exile in Babylon, and he says, make the best of your time in Babylon. Get married, have children, build homes. You will come back. It's going to take 70 years. But you will come back to the land that God has promised you. It's a word of hope. I saw the town hall this week as a word of hope for us too. Even though for 24 years, I've been in Saskatchewan about 24 years, even though for 24 years we've been this crime-infested city in certain parts. So I don't know about you, but I actually feel fairly safe in Regina. And in the 10 years that I've lived here, I've experienced very little to minor crime. Very minor things that have happened. And yet we do have a problem. We do have neighborhoods where where crime happens all the time. One of the men who was on the panel this week is named Jeffrey Brown, and he was one of the pastors that was part of the Boston Miracle. And so he now consults with communities across North America who are concerned about gang-related violence, and he offers them advice on what they did in Boston and what might work in their own communities. And in 2015, he had a TED Talk that he talked about his experience in the Boston Miracle. And he said, at the time, before I started acting, he said, I could stand at my kitchen sink and hear what sounded like firecrackers going off in my neighborhood. But it wasn't firecrackers, it was guns. Excuse me. And people were dying in my neighborhood. Innocent people were dying because we couldn't get a handle on the violence. And he said, I realized that I had been preaching to my church that we needed to do something, but we weren't actually acting, and we were missing a whole segment of the population. We were missing the people that were committing the violence. He didn't say it, but he might have said, I was preaching to the choir, because they're there every week. They're not the ones I need to be preaching to. He said, so I decided to go where the people that were committing the violence were, and I went to volunteer at some of the local high schools and discovered they weren't in high school, because that's not where the people with the guns were. And he said, so then I started walking around the neighborhood, and I realized they weren't out during the day either. They were out at night. So 5 or 6 of the pastors in Boston, in that area, decided they would start walking the neighborhood at night. And they went out on Friday and Saturday nights from 10 to 12 a.m., 10 p.m. to 12 a.m., and they just walked. And they walked the neighborhood. And they were being watched. They were being watched by the police, and they were being watched by the gang members to see what they were doing. What was going to happen here? And nothing happened. They just watched the neighborhood. They were just there. And eventually they started talking to people, and once they started the conversation, they started listening. And what they discovered was that the people who were committing the violence in Boston at that time, it was a very small group of people. And most of the people in the gangs were just trying to overcome the circumstances of their lives. The poverty, the abuse, the difficult home life. Most of the people, he said, that we met were people who were they were young, they didn't have any other option, and they were the ones that were bringing the food home to feed the rest of the family. That's who the people were that we were condemning. And so as these pastors started having these conversations, some of the probation officers and police officers and social workers also started to listen to the conversation and started to pay attention to what these pastors were doing. And eventually they joined in with the pastors and so the Boston Miracle, or ceasefire, Operation Ceasefire as they called it in some ways, started to work together so that they could help some of these people who maybe didn't want to be in a gang but felt it was their only option, find a way out. So they offered education, they offered rehabilitation, they offered employment, they offered support. They made the promise that someone outside the gangs also cared for those individuals and their families. It took 9 years. It was not a quick fix. It took 9 years, but in 9 years in Boston, they decreased the number of deaths by gang-related violence by 79%. It was huge. And they have there's a documentary on YouTube if you decide you want to watch it. One of the things that happened was they got initial success. Yes, we did it. And then they started kind of going, yeah, now we can relax, right? And the violence, so they've had this up and down thing happen in Boston with the violence because they started to relax and went, yeah, we got it covered. And then it came back. It's a long, long process. And maybe that's why we have this long reputation as Regina of having, we get a little spurt of energy, we might get a little bit farther ahead. And if I look at the crime statistics in the last 10 years, we are better than we were 10 years ago about when that Maclean's article came out. It's long. It's a very slow process. But it happens. And it's a word of hope. So I know last week I didn't talk about gang violence. I think I talked about climate change, and I talked about a couple of other things. But I see hope. When I see the things that I've been avoiding, I can also find hope. While climate change may be real, there are people speaking out to the companies, to the governments, to all of the people of the whole world to say, we need to do something about this. There's hope there. It won't be a quick fix. I think I heard the other day we're still experiencing fallout from things that happened in the 1980s. So fixing the environment is not a quick fix, but there are people who care deeply and are willing to move forward with hope. And so I want to assure you, give you some hope too, I trust. The story of the human race is not over, just as the story of Jeremiah and Jerusalem is not over, even though the Babylonian army is standing there waiting to take over. The story of the human race is not over. The story of our life as a faith community is not over. We can find hope in the world around us. We can hang on to that hope in the world around us. And if in those moments when you think, how long, oh Lord, how long does it take to find the resolution to all these issues? Maybe think about Jeremiah, sitting in a jail cell, buying a piece of land he's never going to see because he has heard the word of God, and God has said, I am with you, and this will happen. People will build homes in this land again. It's the promise of God to be with Jeremiah, to be with us, to be with our children and our grandchildren. And it is a promise of hope for tomorrow.